All right. So I've been asked to talk about social cognition. So that's what I'll do. And there'll be another talk on individual cognitive abilities of bees tomorrow morning. So I'll talk about the possibility that some of the most remarkable evolutionary social accomplishments in the insects might, in fact, have originated as individual innovations and subsequent social spread. And the kinds of innovations that I have in mind here when I'm saying that they're remarkable are the mathematically perfect honeycomb as a storage solution for bee eggs and honey and pollen, agriculture-like phenomena, as you can see in the leafcutter ants, these remarkable socially constructed bridges in some ant species, and of course in the honeybees also the dance communication system by which they can communicate about locations using symbols. One of my personal favorites in terms of social insect architectures is shown here on the left. This is a stingless bee of the genus Partamona, which is itself constructed inside an arboreal termite nest. So they excavate a termite nest. Do I have a pointer? Excellent.
I don't know if it's already in. Yep, should be.
Magnificent.
It's not on.
It is, it is.
Oh, okay.
So you have these horizontal combs in the center of the cavity here. They're built on stilts, which means that any invading insect, such as an ant or a wasp, needs to get in through this entrance and walk along the stilts, which makes them much more easily defensible. There is, near the entrance, basically a fake nest with a maze of 3D structures, including fake honeypots, with diluted watery honey, so it's unattractive for any invaders. And inside is this kind of fish trap structure which leads into the cavity where the broods and the real honey is stored. And of course, we've all come to appreciate, well, this is all very complex, nice, but it's all innate. And that's what I want to deconstruct a little bit today. Before I start, I should acknowledge my co-authors on this work, because no one ever listens to these acknowledgements at the end. So Alice Bridges, Ellie Ledbeater, Eric Romero, Quinn Solvi, Erica Dawson, Ollie Lukala, Natasha, and Rossi Savalem have done all the work. I just do the talking. And of course, I've been asked to be comparative in my speech, so there will be corvid birds and primates and other primitive organisms in the talk as well.
No humans.
A few humans as well. So if, let's say, an alien scientist had visited our planet 3 million years ago, she wouldn't have been very impressed with the skills of our ancestors. You would have seen a little, perhaps relatively simple object manipulation tool use, but she would have found the same in some solitary insects, such as these digger wasps, which use objects, pebbles in this case, to tamp down the sand over their nest entrances. But what that scientist would most likely have been more impressed with, let me see if I can start this video. Here, I don't want the sound, thank you. So these leafcutter ants, of course, build structures into the ground that are multiple meters deep and wide, in which they have specialized chambers where to store food, where to grow fungi. They clear roads to trees, which they can then defoliate. They have a labor division where some guard ants guard the roads for others to transport their goodies back into the nest. So if that alien scientist had projected from there into the future and asked where might you most likely find advanced civilizations a few million years down the line, they might have likely thought that this might occur with a higher probability in these social insects than it might in our ancestors. Now, the exploration of other alien minds is a hard one, as you can see in this beautiful quote from Maurice Maeterlinck about the difficulty of comprehending, in this case, honeybee societies. He wrote, "Or let us suppose that an inhabitant of Venus or Mars were to contemplate us from the height of a mountain and watch the little black specks that we form in space as we come and go in the streets and squares of our towns. Would the mere sight of our movements, our buildings, machines, and canals convey to him any precise idea of our morality, intellect, our manner of thinking and loving and hoping? In a word, our real and intimate self? All he could do, like ourselves, when we gaze at the hive, would be to take note of some facts that seem very surprising, and from these facts to deduce conclusions probably no less erroneous, no less uncertain than those that we choose to form concerning the bee. Whither do they tend, and what is it they do, he would ask, after years and centuries of patient watching? What is the aim of their life, or its pivot? I can see nothing that governs their actions. The little things that one day they appear to collect and build up, the next they destroy and scatter. They come and they go, they meet and disperse, but one knows not what it is they seek." So the questions I want to explore today is those of you who know me know that I like to stir the pot a little bit, so these are deliberately provocative questions with relatively little hard evidence, but I want to generate a discussion rather than just confronting you with regular garden-style scientific experiments. So I want to explore whether social insects could be said to have culture or tradition-like phenomena, or at least if this is cognitively plausible, they're basically smart enough. I want to explore whether it's at least plausible that some of the most advanced achievements of social insects, such as their architecture, their foraging innovations, are, or could be, at their root, have been based on individual innovations and subsequent spread via social learning, and possibly became innate only later. Now, when we think of culture in the human species, we typically think of these kinds of phenomena, where let's say in the art, you have an innovator who comes up with a new way of portraying the world, and it subsequently spreads to their peers and gets maintained over time. We might also think of dress codes that are specific to some cultures than others. This tribe here is now largely extinct, which is a shame because I was one of them once, but cultures also vanish. Or we think of food traditions that are again specific to some populations, but not others. I was somewhat amused when I dug up this slide from a lecture about 20 years ago, I think, where I tried to explain to young evolutionary biologists that there are similarities between cultural evolution and genetic evolution. So in genetic evolution, you might find variation within a species, in this case for the shape or coloration of the beak. You find out that some variants get weeded out by natural selection or genetic drift, and certain types prevail and then subsequently spread. And of course, you do find similar phenomena in cultural evolution, where you might have a new device that someone invents, it subsequently spreads. Then some of these devices gradually vanish because they're too bulky or inconvenient. And of course, by now, all of these devices from the 20-year-old slide are extinct as well. But it's just fun to have found this historic slide that shows technologies that are no longer really in existence, except perhaps in museums. But the point there is that, of course, there are similarities of cultural evolution in the human realm and biological evolution. Do animals have culture? So this question is no longer controversial. The answer is yes. There are a good number of documented examples, such as this potato washing in Japanese macaques, where there's actually a record of the first occurrence of this behavior and its subsequent spread. You find this kind of stone tool in some chimps. The these birds fish termites with various devices that they basically shape and subsequently use for the extraction of termites from otherwise difficult to access spaces. Dolphins use sponges, which is a technique that they apparently pick up from their mothers, to dig in the ground where there might be sharp objects, and you, in that way, prevent injuring yourself. And of course, there are various whale songs that also spread by social learning. But in the social insects, of course, we are aware that there are complex modes of communication, such as this honeybee dance, where this dancing bee on the vertical comb, using symbols, tells other individuals in the hive which direction to fly in. So in this case, it's 40, because the dance, this waggle run, is 45 degrees to the right of the vertical. That tells other bees fly 45 degrees to the right of the azimuth of the sun, wherever it currently is. And the fact that the duration in this waggle run codes for distance. So far, so good, but we've all come to learn, at least in the textbooks, that these are all innate behaviors, that there is social learning of coordinates in this case, but that the behavior is entirely innate. Now, that might largely be the case, but even with this so-called dance language, they have to be exposed to it in their youth, so far as you can call it that, to at least deliver a precisely coded a precisely coded distance and direction of a food source relative to the hive. But what I want to really explore now is the question beyond the honeybee dance, is what can bees learn from each other that clearly is not hardwired in any component? Specifically, whether they can learn techniques of object manipulation, whether there might be traditions of a sort in a bee colony, and also whether the architectures of such social insects might in part result from cultural processes. Now, for those of you not familiar with the world of bees, just a quick reminder of what a bee naturally needs to keep in mind. Bees need to be good shoppers in the flower supermarket, because in the flight range of any one hive, there might be dozens of different flower species, all differing in colors, scents, morphologies, and so on. And as a generalist pollinator, you have to remember the signals, the colors, the scents of the flowers that advertise the rewards, the nectar or pollen inside. In many cases, you also have to learn how to manipulate the flowers, because, of course, whatever flower morphologies are in your flight range can't be in your genes, because it might depend on where your colony is located. And so in some flowers, you have to make some quite sophisticated contortions to get to the nectar. And at least simple logic dictates that when you're a bee first leaving the hive, the nest, and looking for a suitable foraging source, then one useful thing to look among the dozens of flower species that you're finding out there is to look where there's already foraging activity. And that's pretty much like if you're in a new town, let's say Bochum, you're looking around for a suitable restaurant, you wouldn't choose one that's completely empty when there's another one next door that's actually packed with a crowd, because very likely that latter one is going to be a better restaurant. And the question is whether bees indeed learn from conspecifics where to look for suitable bee restaurants, flowers. So we use artificial flowers of these kinds of types, as you see here. There are two types here, orange ones and green ones, and you can see that the orange ones are very popular and the green ones are not. That's because the orange ones have food and the green ones don't. And here's a bee observing this scenario from a distance through a window, and we subsequently remove the bees, clean the flowers, and ask this bee, well, which flower type do you now prefer, the green ones or the orange ones? And indeed, if the green ones have been observed as rewarding in this phase, then it turns out that this bee, if it's subsequently asked which ones do you now prefer, will choose the in this case, the green ones over the orange ones, or if the demonstrators are on orange, they'll choose the orange ones. So they can indeed learn by observations which flowers are better. This is a case of a form of classical conditioning, most likely, albeit with two steps. So this is a form of, we call it, or since Pavlov, it's called second order conditioning, where you first learn, and outside this scenario is that the presence of conspecifics is more likely indicative of rewards. You then see your conspecifics on a certain flower type, associate that flower type with conspecific and set by second order as a reward, and subsequently you then prefer the same colors. So that's a form of relatively simple conditioning. Now, with regards to flower manipulation, we have already seen that there are some fairly complex morphologies. Another technique that bees sometimes use is so-called nectar robbing, where rather than entering flowers through the front door and touching the reproductive parts and subsequently pollinating them, some bees don't actually care about pollinating flowers, they care about getting rewards. So what some bees do is they simply puncture the spur of a flower and extract the nectar in that way, because that's a shortcut to get to the nectar. And that phenomenon's been known for a while, and Darwin observed it and thought the following. He saw that honeybees did it wherever bumblebees did, and he said this: I think the hive bees either saw the bumblebees cutting the holes and understood what they were doing and immediately profited by their labor, or they merely imitated the bumblebees after they cut the holes. Should this be verified, it will be a very instructive case of acquired knowledge in insects. We should be astonished that one genus of monkeys adopt from another a particular manner of opening hard-shelled fruit. How much more so ought we to be in a tribe of insects, so preeminent for their instinctive faculties, which are generally supposed to be in inverse ratio to the intellectual. And Ellie Leadbeater did a number of experiments with these contraptions that are a mixture of natural flowers and syringes that actually allow refilling with nectar remotely, and indeed found that bumblebees would learn this technique by observing each other. So not only can bumblebees learn the nectar robbing by observation, bumblebees can also copy learned preferences from honeybees, and vice versa. Honeybees can learn from bumblebees which flowers to visit. So this was merely an observation at Darwin's time, but he was, experiments show that he was actually correct in suggesting that bumblebees and honeybees can learn from each other, not just from members of their own species. Now, when I present this kind of work to colleagues working with, say, clever, iconic members of a sort of class of animals that are generally viewed as being intelligent, corvid birds, for example, then people will say, well, yes, okay, we believe that bees can learn about flower colors and how to manipulate flowers, because that's what a bee does every day. But what about things that they do not encounter daily in their natural lives? And here's a paradigm that explores that. So this is, of course, a kind of paradigm that is not encountered on a daily basis in the realm of insects. But once you train a bee like that, you have a single individual that solves it, you can then observe the spread of a technique through a social group by similar social network analyses as people do who look at social media networks, where a meme originates, how rapidly it spreads, and to whom, by whom it's copied, and so on. And this is what we did here. So we have all the individuals of a colony arranged in a circle. Each dot is one bee. And when you see a line forming, that means there is an interaction of the type that you've just seen in the video, one experienced bee paired with a non-experienced bee. And when the target individual of that line turns color, that means it has mastered the technique for the first time by itself. And you can see that there are now several orange bees here. These are all individuals that have learned the technique from yellow 31 at the top. That's the innovator that figured it out first. But you can also see down here there are now 2 purple bees. And these are individuals that have no longer picked up the technique from yellow 31, but from one of the orange bees. So there's several sequential generations. They're not biological generations, but sequential sets of learners that help spread this technique through the entire social group. And in this case, the technique even continued spreading after yellow 31 had died. They only live a few weeks, so that occurs naturally in the course of longer period experiments. But the point there is that, of course, you have in this social group a technique that is not shared by any other bumblebee colony across the globe. Only they can do it, and only through social learning. And indeed, if you train multiple bees in this kind of way, then they actually appear to cooperate at pulling out the strings. And indeed, Olli Lukala, one of the former postdocs who worked on this project, has now his own lab, and he found that indeed bees learn to cooperate at such object manipulation tasks. Now, in this particular experiment, of course, there's only one technique. You pull out the string. There are not multiple options how you can pull it out. But here we did something slightly different. We had a puzzle box where there's a reward under a transparent lid over this yellow area. And to get to the reward, you have to push this lid either counterclockwise by pushing the blue tab or clockwise by pushing the red tab. So there are 2 equivalent solutions. Both work. You can do it either way. The options are both available to all bees, and we're asking how they will cope with this solution when there are these 2 options. And what you can see here there's an individual here that's learned to do the clockwise pushing of red, and once it's rotated the lid far enough, it gets the reward. And in this case, it's the blue tab that has been pushed to get to the reward. And we can do the same thing as before. We train one individual, insert it into a colony, and then see which technique will be subsequently used by the rest of the colony. And so that's the schematic view of that kind of box. There is a flight arena with multiple such boxes. We have one trained individual, and then we observe what the rest of them does. Each bar here is one colony of bees, one social group, one queen with her workers. And in these colonies, B1 and B2, we inserted a blue pusher, so blue counterclockwise. And you can see that the vast majority of opening events are in the same direction. There's a tiny minority that explores the alternative, but it happens very rarely. In colonies R1 and R2, you find the precise opposite. When there's a single technique demonstrated, everyone copies it. No one hardly ever tries anything else. 2 control colonies in this experiment over 6 days never tried opening the boxes at all. They didn't manage it. We then did the same experiments over a longer period. Again, this colony was blue trained, this one was red trained, that was all they do. Remarkably, 2 control colonies over this longer period, actually some bees managed to open these boxes, but in this case, blue clearly also dominated. So there's a clear effect of whatever is demonstrated is copied by everyone. A tiny minority that tries something else rapidly abandons that and sticks with that. So here's just a sped up video demonstration of 4 cameras over the single flight arena. We take the boxes out every time the nectar is removed and put them back in. But you can see, so this is a culture of clockwise pushers, and you can see that's all that ever happens. So they only open the boxes with one technique, and that's by pushing the red tab, never the blue one. So this, they'll just copy whatever is demonstrated and then stick with it. Now, what happens if we insert into a colony both techniques? So we train a bee that can open, that does the blue pushing, and another bee that does the red pushing. Insert both individuals into a colony. And you can see what happens here over the number of days. So in this colony, for example, they start out on day 2 about equally pushing red and blue, and that equality is sort of retained over about a week. And then from about day 9, you can see that one of the 2 variants gradually dominates until basically everyone pushes red. And in this colony, the events happen in the opposite direction. So after a few days, when there were just a few opening instances of both, blue wins. So again, there is a majority, and once you have a majority, everyone copies the majority. So in this experiment, where there are 2 possibilities demonstrated to a colony, there's some time over which both techniques are tried, but then everyone copies whatever everyone else is doing. Now, one of the things that is unique about human culture, as opposed to what we know in chimps and other animals, is that it's, of course, uniquely cumulative. We all, on a daily basis, use devices that are built on multiple sequential generations of engineers, mathematicians, and so on, symbolized here by putting humans on extraterrestrial objects, bodies. So no human, of course, can singly come up with all the sequential steps that lead to this. And this is one of the things that were thought until recently to be entirely unique to humans, that humans were the only species that can learn things socially that they cannot learn individually. And so we tried with bumblebees to explore exactly that question. Can we teach them multiple step solutions to, in this case, puzzle box opening, that are so complex that they could never come up with it by themselves? You saw earlier that at least in a few instances, bees managed to open these boxes by themselves. And so the 2-step box that we're using here is one where, again, you have to rotate the red tab to come over the yellow area, and then you get the reward. But the red tab is also blocked by a blue tab that first needs to be moved out of the way. So you need to move the blue tab to be able to move the red tab. And so here's an individual using that technique. So she's learned that I can't push the red tab without first moving the blue tab. Note that there's no reward in this case for just pushing the blue tab, other than you can subsequently move the red tab. These are difficult to open because the surfaces are slippery, because we need to clean them with alcohol to eliminate any scent marks. But this bee clearly manages the 2-step technique that we've taught her. Here's an individual following that trained individual that you've just seen. So there's, again, an observer that has no idea how to solve this task. The trained bee comes, they're first faffing about a bit with the red tab. Then this trained individual knows she has to put blue out of the way. And now she's pushing the red tab. The observer has clearly a keen interest in what that bee does, but she can't solve it yet by herself. The question is, can that individual now solve the technique after some social learning? So this was, for bees at least, a fairly extended training protocol. So we paired demonstrators, skilled individuals, with observers for 30 of the sessions you've just seen. Then we ask the observer, can you now do it? If they pass, we then test them multiple times sequentially to see if they can actually reliably solve the task. If they failed it, we gave them 5 more sessions. If they failed it again, we gave them 5 more. And doing that, we managed to, or the bees managed to, in 5 out of 15 cases, to pass the learning test, not just to solve the task a single time, but multiple times sequentially and reliably to solve this 2-step puzzle box opening. The point here is that no individual ever managed to do this by herself without social learning. So just to recapitulate what we did earlier with the 2-step puzzle box opening, where you could rotate it either this way or one way. So this was the simple one-step solution. And we found in colonies that we tested long enough, these control colonies, that at least a good number of individuals managed to solve the task by themselves without social learning or without us inserting a trained individual. But with this two-step puzzle box, we tested 2 colonies for 12 days, another one for 24 days. No individual ever managed to come up by herself with the full 2-step protocol. They had to learn it socially. Now, usually we're, of course, a number of years ahead of the chimp people, but in this case, we're almost scooped. So in the same year, there was a group around Joseph Cole which found that in chimps you can also find this kind of social learning of a 2-step puzzle box opening behavior, but nature covered them both in one news and views. So simultaneous discovery there. But here's a primate researcher actually talking about our bee work, which is very flattering, of course. So this is Dame Jane Goodall about our bumblebees. So this for me was very moving because Jane Goodall was one of my sort of youth heroines, and inspired me to go into animal behavior in the first place. And for her to say that, hey, I'd like to be young now and study bumblebees was quite something. So the social learning experiment here, however, has a slight trick that I need to explain a little better. So you can see 3 balls here. There are now 3 options to solve the task. Obviously, if you're clever, you want to pick the closest ball and move it to the center. But this bee, the demonstrator, the skilled bee, actually knows I can't do that because the bloody experimenters have glued the other balls to the surface. So this ball and this one can't be moved in this demonstration experiment. They're glued, okay? And that bee has learned that, and so whenever she solved this task, she moves the furthest ball to the center, and there's an observer, again, one that's never rolled a ball for reward before, and once the task is complete, they both get a big drop of nectar. And again, we do that a few times, and then ask the observer, well, how do you now solve the task? And in this case, the balls are not glued down, and our question here is, does the observer simply ape the actions that she's witnessed and moves the furthest ball, or will there be a spontaneous improvement of what's been demonstrated by moving the closest ball? And the latter is what happens. You can see that individual's very clumsy at moving balls because she's never rolled balls before. All she's done is observe the other bee rolling it, but she spontaneously picks a different ball, the closest ball to the target area, to move it. So there is not just faithful copying of a solution that's been demonstrated. In cases where there's clearly a better alternative, you also find spontaneous improvements, which to us indicates that there's some sort of awareness of the ideal end state. So just to wrap up this section, we do have innovation in bees of novel behaviors that have not been performed by any individuals in these species evolutionary past. We find a quite rapid spread by social learning through colonies. We find with our puzzle boxes that there's faithful copying over extended periods and a conformity to the most common behavior. But in this ball rolling experiment, there's also spontaneous improvement. Now, of course, in our bumblebees, they're temperate, so they cannot rescue any acquired information over into the next season because the whole colony except the new queens dies. But one useful candidate for exploring whether there's indeed multiple generation, perhaps cultural learning, might be tropical stingless bees. So here's an example. This is not our work, but this is a Brazilian study of within species variation of colony constructions. Again, the combs, like in the Partamona example that I showed earlier, are horizontal, but some colonies in this species build several parallel layers on top of each other, whereas others of the same species build these kinds of spiral shapes. And of course, that is exactly the kind of scenario that's useful to explore for whether such within species differences might either be genetic or whether they're at some level culture or something else. Turns out in this case it's something else. So what the authors did is they basically cross-fostered colonies that came either from horizontal combs, parallel ones, or spiral-shaped ones, put them into the respective opposite type, and ask, well, what kind of structure do you build now? And it turns out that the transplanted bees, so the ones that came from horizontal colonies that were put into spiral shapes, suddenly built spiral shapes, and vice versa. The ones that came from spiral shapes here built horizontal combs. And what these authors found with some clever experiments is that the memory is in the structure. It is not in the heads of the bees. So what they did here, for example, is they started with a horizontal combed colony and twisted up just a slight bit the end of the construction here, so that it basically generated the origin of a spiral. And in that case, the bees in this horizontal combed colony suddenly build spiral shapes. So the memory here is not in the heads of the bees, it's in the construction itself. And whatever constructions the bees find, they continue building. So there might still be exciting examples of social learning in these perennial species of bees, but we haven't found such examples yet. Now, if they're so clever, then why do you not find bees using any kind of advanced technology? So I love this title from Martin Heisenberg's lab, Can a Fly Ride a Bicycle? And I found this little image in correspondence. The point is most likely that there is, in many cases, no relevant selection pressure for the bees to come up with any kind of technology such as shown here. If you can already get from A to B fast by flying, then you don't need to, there's no selection pressure to build additional contraptions for locomotion. It's not actually that easy to come up with a scenario where you would actually do better as a bee with some sort of clever technology. Of course, in humans, likewise, you often find that there seems to be very little or no innovation over very extended periods. So Pitt Rivers was one of the first people who was interested in cultural evolution over time and assembled all of these spearheads and boomerang technologies and so on, aligning them basically in the equivalent of phylogenetic trees in the penultimate century. And of course, you can actually construct phylogenetic trees of spearheads. And you often find that there's literally no technological progress over very extended periods. So we pride ourselves now because in the last few centuries, of course, there's an exponential development of all kinds of technologies, but that clearly wasn't always the case. And of course, technological innovations beget more technological innovations, but so long as your spearheads work fine, there's actually no need to develop anything any further. So there are indeed extended periods of stagnation also in human prehistory. On the other hand, there are clear examples in the human case of cultural innovations having an effect on genetic evolution. And one example is lactose tolerance in adults. So I like this historic Egyptian depiction of milking a cow, in part because it shows that you can actually leave the calves with the cow, and then actually that promotes milk production to some extent. So you don't necessarily have to do unethical things to get to milk products, but somehow we've abandoned that knowledge. But the point there is that human populations that do not have a history of using animal milk do not have the gene for lactose tolerance in adulthood. So the innovation came first, genetic evolution making us tolerant of milk products in adulthood came later. So to return to our alien scientist visiting our planet, I earlier said 3 million years ago. So if that individual scientist had returned to the planet 300,000 years later, they might have been disappointed to see that there wasn't very much progress either in our ancestors or in the solitary wasps or in the various species of bees. And the point that I'm making here is that that scientist might simply have come too early for there to have been much progress in our hominid ancestors, and too late, possibly, for witnessing the spread of cultural innovations in the social insects. So I'll conclude with another quote from Maurice Maeterlinck, who said this about the bees. What have we to do, some will ask, with the intelligence of the bees? The discovery of a sign of true intellect outside ourselves procures us something of the emotion Robinson Crusoe felt when he saw the imprint of a human foot on the sandy beach of his island. We seem less solitary than we had believed. So just the conclusions from this talk. So there is clear empirical evidence that bees can learn from each other which flowers to visit and how to manipulate objects, including strings and balls and, of course, nectar robbing. There are culture-like phenomena, such as copy the majority. There is evidence that bees, like chimps now, can learn multi-step solutions only by social learning, or things that are too complicated to innovate alone. There are, at least cognitively, it's therefore plausible that there are behavioral traditions that persist over multiple generations, and if so, it's at least plausible that some of the most impressive accomplishments in foraging strategies, social insect architecture, and organization might at least have, in some cases, begun as individual innovations, socially spread, and only much later became cemented into an innate behavior routine. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you that I can be here and give a talk on another animal cognition topic. Yeah, there are a lot of studies about pain and other negative stimuli in animals. So what I did was actually looking into studies that focused on the more positive topic, which is animal play behavior. And what I found out was there are very interesting facts about animal play behavior, or about play behavior in general. And it is actually a bit sad that it has not been looked into so much in the current literature. And so here's a short overview. So I will first introduce play behavior and why it's important and why I think it can be seen as a multifunctional tool. Then I will talk about why I now focus on play signals and their impact on animal communication, or how you could study animal communication or complex animal communication by studying animal play signals. And then I will have some take-home messages for you in the end. So play can be seen as a multifunctional tool. We know that in humans and also in some other species, it has been investigated that play has a lot of functions during development, so that animals and humans, well, we are also animals, so we need play to develop a lot of different skills in our life that are also important during adulthood, and we develop them during childhood, but also, of course, at least in the human case and also in some other animals, we see that even when they are adults, they still play in one way or another. So why do we play? Yeah, well, we can enhance our motor skills by playing, because playing involves a lot of fighting or hunting behavior that we can then therefore foster during development. we also can enhance some of our social skills, because what we do is we have social learning skills involved during play. We have deception. We have maybe some theory of mind, depending on the species, of course. Perspective taking and also cooperation and, well, of course, also competition. We can also benefit immediately from play sessions, because we can increase our immediate well-being, because play leads to a release of opioids and other nice things that we want in our brains, because they make us feel good. And also we can gain third-party information about our playmates directly, so that we then know how to interact with them also in more serious contexts, for example. And there is also a fourth domain, what I called now meta-skill enhancement. And this is about that play can help us to increase general cognitive abilities, problem-solving abilities, behavioral flexibility, emotion regulation, and self-assessment or self-assurance. The rest of the time I will focus especially on play signals. And why did I choose play signals for investigating animal communication? And the reason is that play signals are quite complex, and also play can be complex, at least in most social mammalian species, but also in other species. I know that there is also a study on bumblebees and play behavior. So also insects might indeed be playing and have complex behaviors of play. And we need this complex communication in play, because what we don't want during play is that it escalates into fights or into some serious conditions that will not be so nice and would not foster our well-being, and also not group well-being. So what happened is that there developed some stereotyped signals with meta-communicative function, such as what follows is play. Like, it's not serious behavior. Like, it's behaviors that are shown before some play bite or some attack during play starts, to make sure that the partner knows that it's about play. And play signals are used in different contexts. They can be used as an invitation to play, like to ask whether the partner also wants to play. They can be used for sustaining play, like in between different actions during play, to still make sure that it stays play for all the attendants of the play. And it can also be used for direct de-escalation purposes in serious contexts, like to say, like, oh, what I just did, I'm sorry for that. I don't want to escalate this into a fight. And this makes it that play signals can be used to actively design background conditions to facilitate and enhance learning, because play context, as I have told you before, apparently fosters quite a lot of abilities and enhances our learning, at least during development. And therefore, I think that play is an especially interesting tool to investigate communication in a comparative sense, because you can find play also in other species. I will now have a short excursion into the theory of communication. And I first will start with what is Gricean communication. It is about the intentional view of communication, and it was developed by Grice, but also other people did a bit of research and then adjusted the view accordingly. And Grice says that communication is about producing a response in the intended receiver, and the receiver needs to recognize that I want to produce the response, and then this recognition is the reason for the receiver's response. But the problem with this is that this requires at least third-order intentionality, in the sense of, I know that you think that I intend something, or I intend you to do something. And the problem with this is that then only individuals with very sophisticated theory of mind abilities can be included in communicating. And, well, human children develop this at 4 years of age, like this explicit second order and third order intentionality, like second order beliefs. And then we can either say, well, we take it as that, and children below the age of around 4 are not communicating, and also animals are not communicating, or we say, well, maybe something is wrong with this presuppositions. There are, of course, a few possibilities to solve this problem, but I won't go into detail of them now. Weaker versions have developed, and Tomasello has developed a version where he talks about intentional signals. And he says that they are, like a signal is intentionally communicative if it is used in a flexible way. It includes a learning component, and the user is aware of the receiver's attentional state. So what I now did is I a little bit adjusted these words of Tomasello's and developed a minimal form of intentional communication. And what I now propose is that an information exchange between two organisms counts as minimal intentional communication if the sender S fulfills the following 3 criteria. And first, S has learned or refined at least parts of the used signals or the context in which the signal is used. S can use the signals flexibly, attuning it, for example, to the context or the receiver. And S is sensitive to the receiver's attentional state and direct the signals towards the receiver and is able to adapt the signals accordingly, which is quite similar to that what Tomasello said, but I wanted to formulate it a bit differently to then make sure that we can test this with experimental paradigms that already exist, or at least we can look at paradigms that have already been set to work and see what the outcome is when we look at play signals. There are 2 play signals that I want to look at because they have been researched quite well, and also they exist in quite a lot of different animal species. First is the play phase, or relaxed open mouth display, what you can see here in the hyena and in the tantalus monkey phase. It's just it's common among various types of mammals. As you can see here, like hyenas and tantalus monkeys are not so closely related, and they also exist in a lot of other species. It's an exaggerated facial expression with an open mouth, which is quite relaxed, and at least lower teeth are revealed, but in some cases even the upper teeth are revealed, and then it's called a full play phase. This is a bit about the details, and so animals can even, or some species at least, can even differentiate between these 2, like a half play phase, I would say, and a full play phase. The other one is the play bow, which you might have also seen in dogs, for example, on the streets. It's the front part of the body is bent down while the hind part of the body is still raised up. And of course, this can also be combined with the play phase. In dogs, it might also involve like tail wagging or barking or whatever kind of stuff. So this is just a little reminder of what I've said before. It's about learning parts of the signals. It's about the flexibility of use and about the sensitivity to the receiver's attentional state. And we will now look at these 3 in the 2 play signals I have shown you before. So first, the question is whether they involve a learning component. In the case of the play phase, we see that it's a quite stereotyped movement, which does not have a lot of flexibility in itself, but we see that it is that the context in which the animals show this is learned during their lifespan, or at least in some species. The situation in which it is used and also the follow-up behavior is learned. So it's different when they are puppies, when dogs are puppies. They use it in more context than when they grow up, because then they just refine when they should use it and when they need to use it and when they don't. And in the case of the play phase, we have different forms for different intensities that also vary with age, as I have already told you. And there is an indication of of use refined by learning, which means that the social structure of the species, which is of course like species bound, but also the specific group the animal is in influences the signals, like how they are shown and how frequently they're shown, and the exact expression. Whether they can be used flexibly would be the next question to explore. And it appears that both of these signals are flexibly adjusted to situations and also to play partners. For dogs and hyenas, for example, the quantity and quality is adjusted to the probability of misunderstandings and escalations, both dependent on who is the partner and how is the hierarchy, and also depending on, for example, which season it is and how cooperatively the group behaves and where there are conflicts in the group going on and in the group hierarchy going on. They tend to show it more or less frequently towards partners with which they might have like a hierarchical conflict going on. In the case of squirrel monkeys, it's interesting because typically they have a very, very strict hierarchy, and when someone upper in the hierarchy demands something from someone lower, then they have to do it, whatever it is. But one exception is the play phase as a play invitation, because this can be rejected independently of age or rank order, and it's accepted that it's rejected. And in the case of wolves, playboy and play phase are not only used in play situations, but as I have also linked to earlier, they are also used to promote friendly contact with unknown conspecifics. Whether they involve a sensitivity to the receiver's attention, we can see that for dogs and primates, both are performed only in the view of the partner, and they are also preceded by attention-getting signals if the partner does not pay attention. So if you have a dog or a wolf and they stand before each other, but the other one is facing away, then they won't show the play face directly, but they will try to get the attention of the other to then show the face or the play bow when they are really looking at them. In hyenas, who only show the play face but not the play bow, there the play face is also dependent on receiver attention. They show it more often when the receiver is attending to them than when there's not. And in chimpanzees, this seems to even include third-party audience. Like if you, there's some interesting studies on chimpanzees who show the play face or the play face more often when the mother of the infant they are just playing with is looking or is watching the play sequence. So yeah, to my take-home messages, I would say that according to the studies that have been conducted and that I have found so far on animal play behavior, we can say that animal play signals indeed involve a minimal form of intentional communication. Playbow and playface at least involve a learning component of at least the context of use, and they also are used flexibly dependent on context and receivers. And playbow and playface are used with a sensitivity to the receiver's attentional state and might even be preceded by attention-getting signals before being performed. And this shows, I think, that the study of animal play as a complex communicative behavior could yield very important further insights into animal intentionality and also animal communication, as well as, of course, their ability of understanding others. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
I was just informed that we are too late and I have to cut it down by 5 minutes, which is easy. I have not that much to say. So this is the beginning slide in which I just say that I love animals and I want to understand how they work. This is the worst way you can study animals in a comparative psychology way. You take a test and then take a lot of animals and then say, okay, make a story out of the ranking. But how else to do it? So I'm working with pigeons and other animals and birds. The main problem with them is that they have this small brain. This is a collection of brains from my lab. The pigeon brain is on the left, and that's rather typical for the small brain size of our birds. And in addition, I have to say that they do not have a cortex, so seem to be inferior somehow. If you look at the cortex, you can see the two pathways that analyze everything at the sensory level and combine everything so they can associate everything with everything. And in this miserable brain of a pigeon, there is not much anything resembling a cortical tissue. If you add this to the small size of their brains, in this case, relative to the rhesus monkey brain, you end up with seeing the birds as little robots. Nice ones, but robots. Now, as you all know, this has changed. In the last 20 to 30 years, the avian cognitive revolution started, and we now know that at least corvids and parrots are on par with apes. And that has changed everything. It became cool to work with birds. Birds are the new cool, and there are all kinds of rankings of the smartness of birds. I'm very happy, if you look to the right side, that even pigeons were hailed to be as one of these smart birds. Now, obviously, this is not science. This is folklore. But how do you do science? And I will introduce 3 ways to do it, possibly a slightly better way. The first one is about taking a lot of cognitive tests that make sense because they pattern a certain area of cognition, and then do the experiments or go through the literature and try to use experiments that are test fair, as good as you can do this, between different species. And then you can have a patterning of the cognitive umbrella. This is something that I did a couple of years ago with my friend Thomas Bugnia from the University of Vienna, and we used 8 different cognitive areas: self-recognition, reasoning, object permanence, metacognition, theory of mind, mental time travel, vocalization learning. We were forced to do this by this reviewer, otherwise we could not publish in ticks, so we included it, and delay of gratification. Each of these areas comes with different subcomponents, and I will just show you one of them. So delay of gratification had 3 subcomponents, 3 subtests that were tested in the literature, all of them under the umbrella of delay of gratification. We compared the literature of corvids and parrots on one side and monkeys and apes on the other side. So the exchange task is one of the 3 delay of gratification tests that were used on all of these different species. So if you would apply it to me, I very unfortunately like candy. You would give me a plate with candy and I have to stare at it and I'm at your mercy. At some point, you swap the candy for a baklava, which I like much more, and the question is, how long can I stand that? And obviously, we don't use candies and baklava, but other things that these animals like, a little bit or much more. And then you have 6 minutes for the raven, 15 minutes for one of these African greys. Okay, these are capuchins. Can't expect much more from them. But chimpanzees, 4 minutes. So that looks a bit bad for the primates, but there are other aspects of delay of gratification, other test procedures where there is a little bit more even. So the beauty here is that we could come up with a conclusion that birds, corvids and parrots on one side and primates on the other side do not show a systematic difference. So there are meanwhile more data on this. Simone Pica conducted 31 different cognitive tests, and she comes to the very similar conclusion. That's nice. You pattern a cognitive area. The downside is you always take the peak performances of the animal. You don't know how they do this. So what is the way to do it? So I'll switch now gears and give a second example of this. A couple of years ago, Stephen Granger published a study on baboons that they learn English orthography. And he said the reason is because they have a primate cortex. And I was furious about it. And I said, okay, that's bullshit. I do the same with pigeons, and I will publish it and say this is only because they have a bird brain. So what is done here? We take a very large number of English words with 4 letters, for example, done. And the animal has to pack the word when it is properly written, orthography correct, and has to pack the star when it's a non-word, so wrongly written. So obviously the animals have no clue what we want, and they are completely at chance level, but miraculously they get better and better and better over time. Then we take a completely new battery of words and non-words, and they do fine from the first trial on. Very nice. How do they do this? they use two different cognitive strategies. One is the average bigram frequency, so they look for the frequency of certain combinations of two letters in English, and they look how frequent they are in English words. And the higher the frequency is in this complete word, the more they are likely to pack on word. Otherwise, they pack on non-word. Levenshtein distance is the number of letters that you've exchanged to turn a non-word into a word. Similar strategies. And they're doing this, and we do this, humans, we do this when we glance over a text, and baboons do this. That was a very nice result of our paper. And to make it very clear, I'm not talking of reading. I'm just talking about input statistics. So orthography at that level, and they are equal in performance and in the way they proceeded. But we did it now much better, and this was done with the help of Benjamin Gagel, who is now a professor in Cologne. He approached all of us and said, would you donate your data and help us to do the analysis? This is a computer program. It's a computational model based on predictive coding that decides on the strategy of the animals. And you can analyze three different strategies. Are you concentrating on aspects of a letter, so pixel-wise nearly, or on the full letter, or on the combination of letters? So what you could show is that all three species use at times pixel, letter, and letter sequence level representations. That's fine, but there are deeper differences. And now you already see these typical symbols of global local processing. You can see this is an S, but it is constituted by smaller H letters. So already you see what I'm hinting for. So we humans predominantly rely on global processing, but easily switch to local processing if ever needed. So we start with global, but have no problem to go local. And that's exactly how humans worked in this task. Monkeys can also do the same, but they have a predominance for local. And if that doesn't work, they go for global. And what about pigeons? They are crazy about small details because that's their ecology. They walk on the ground and they look for little pixels which could symbolize a grain scattered in pebbles and dirt. And that's exactly how they approach the problem. So what you see is you have perceptual differences that are due to the ecology of the animal, that they guide their cognitive properties. So they all are doing fine, but they use it by partly different routes of processing. And the last example I'm going to give you is this one. I was sitting years ago at the beach. Kids were playing around in the sea. My wife was chatting with the neighbors, possibly about their husbands, and I was reading this very old vintage paper of Nick McIntosh, and I suddenly said, that's it, that's it. So it's serial reversal learning, very, very simple. But the beauty of that is you start with the acquisition of a very simple task. For example, discriminate two different colors. And then you start series of reversals. The first one is awful because you have to inhibit the old associative trace. And then comes the learning to learn effect, if it exists or not. So all of that can be mathematically covered and potentially compared with the first acquisition where all the motor program, the perceptual program, and everything is already included. So I convinced my colleagues, you can see Alice Auersberg, Thomas Bugnia, Russell Gray, Jonas Rose, Alex Taylor, and Auguste von Bayern to do the study with me with their birds. So we had a standardized methodology, a multi-lab collaboration, which is very hip now, with 4 corvids, 3 parrot species, and pigeons. We used Q-learning to differentiate alpha as the learning rate and beta as a strategy between explorative and exploitative choices. And for pigeons, we use 2 different tasks, and I will explain in a minute why you use 2 groups of pigeons with different tasks. So structure very easy, serial reversal learning, alpha and beta to devise the learning rate and the strategy of the animals. So here we have our species, and all species were tested with things that resemble what is here done with the great green macaws in Auguste von Bayern's lab. So they indicate which trough to take, and then this is turned around and the animal can see whether there is food inside, and if there is inside, they can take the food, or whether it's empty, so they had the wrong choice. We did something similar with our pigeons. This is not a picture from this experiment. This is given by Martina Manns, where she did brain asymmetry task with that. But it's exactly how we did it. We took yogurt cups, filled them with grit in a certain color, and within that grit, on one side with a pebble, was a grain, piece of grain. So the animals had to search in that grit to find that grain. And obviously, this is demanding. And much more easy is a Skinner box task. So we did the very same study in the Skinner box. We used this for the following reason. We took two extremely different tasks to look whether alpha is still the same, the learning rate is still the same, but could disambiguate beta as a search strategy of the animals. And that's exactly what happens. So we could not find a significant difference for alpha, but significant differences for the strategies of these animals, with the manual experiment, the yogurt cup experiment, being much more preservative, and the Skinner box being much more exploitative. So now we are set up. We can now do all the study with the different animals. These are the learning curves. I just skipped that. Of course, many, many different significant differences. But the interesting thing is alpha and beta. So here you have this graph. And I walk you through. Although I do not have time, don't panic, I walk you through. This is alpha. This is the abscissa. And the higher you get, the higher is alpha, the smarter the animals are. Each dot is an individual animal. If you're at that end, you study at the university. If you're at that end, you are intellectually challenged. Who's intellectually challenged? Well, the pigeons, obviously, but also the azure-winged magpies. But they use different kinds of beta. So they use different exploitative or explorative strategies, and we can differentiate that at the significance level. We have the jackdaws somewhere in between. And then we have those species that do not show a significant difference of alpha. The cockatoos, the great green macaws, the blue macaw, the New Caledonian crows, the ravens. But they show differences in beta. So the parrots are much more preservative, while the crows, the corvids, are much more explorative. So you can clearly differentiate learning rate from strategy. Now the interesting thing is the learning to learn effect. Do the animals understand that there is a deeper structure in the task? So, and that's very interesting, because then we could show very strong species differences. And you can see the higher alpha is now at the ordinate, the higher the learning to learn effect. We have very interesting stratification between the animals that we can clear off of beta. So beta is not now intervening into the degree of alpha. So, and what is the correlate of the learning rate of the animal? Well, it's the pallial mass, and so correlated with that pallial neuron numbers. We have very high correlations for neuron, for pallial mass. We can translate this, meanwhile, into neuron numbers between alpha, and that's also true for the basal ganglia, which is not surprising because both of them correlate. The neurons in pallium and neurons in basal ganglia correlate. Pallium, just as an explanation, is what our hippocampus, amygdala plus cortex is. So we have a very high correlation for alpha with in these birds, and we have nothing of that for beta. So strategy does not correlate with the neural measures that we have. So what you see now is 3 different strategies. Each of them has their pros and cons. The first, the cognitive patterning, is just great because you can see patterns in cognition, but you work with top performances. It's like the Olympics. Is the top scorer in 100-meter running representative of humans? Obviously not. But it still is indicative. The second one is a deep dive into the structure of a certain task. And that tells you a lot about the strategy of the animal, but that's very demanding. The third one, obviously, is something in between. You learn a lot about the strategies and the cognitive properties of a learning rate in different species, but you have to be incredibly careful to choose the task in a proper way. So 3 ways to do it, maybe half right. I still don't know what is the complete right of that. With this, I shut up, give now the microphone to Albert, and then we have maybe a very short discussion in the very end.
Yeah, so let me switch to the general question, how we can do comparative cognition. We have now talked about social cognition, play behavior, and more specific comparisons that Onur Güntürkün presented by looking at birds and having the same type of study for different types of birds. If we now want to go for a more general species comparison, and more general abilities, and one example is empathy. How can we do that? I will only outline in the short time remaining the basic idea how we can make progress to compare humans and maybe birds and mammals in principle, and maybe also fish, so that we have a general framework where we not easily can design very analog type of tests for going beyond different species, and we do not have the observation that the neural processes are the same type, because mammals, as we have heard, and birds have quite different type of neural organization. Also, they maybe discovered some computational analogs. So, which cognitive abilities do non-human animals have? If we now ask a question about a more general complex ability of empathy, do non-human animals have empathy? There can be a romantic view, okay. Each similar performance is also, if we observe it, it's a kind of implementing the same mechanisms in humans, and there is a danger of anthropomorphizing, or there can be a killjoy explanation. Even if it's the same behavior, it cannot be the same mechanism, it must be different, and therefore it should not be interpreted that way. I think one example that one more methodological remark and then go to the example. So what we should do to not run into either over-interpreting into anthropomorphizing or under-interpreting into the killjoy interpretation is ideally we would follow the maxims: no anthropomorphizing of animal abilities so easily, but do not miss relevant similarities discovered by species adequate testings, and no over-intellectualization of human abilities on the other hand, as Cameron Buckner calls it, Anthropofabulation, if we think that anything that humans do must be complex cognition involving. Okay, so the alternative account for a species comparison is what I call a multidimensional profile account. And as you will see, it's joint work with Maja Griem about this case study of empathy, and joint work with Leonard Dung about the general methodology. So for reasons of time, I just start with the explication of the general strategy very shortly. The basic idea is search for the most relevant underlying cognitive abilities. If you think about empathy, what are the most relevant underlying cognitive abilities you must have to be an empathic animal? And then you think about features for each of these dimensions that are implementing it to test these important dimensions, and then you put all that information together to build a species-specific comparative profile. That's the abstract idea. Now, and it ends up with something like this kind of profile, which I want to build up now step by step as a profile of empathy for different species. So that's the aim. Now, the concrete case is for humans, a case of empathy is described in the following way. Tom is a neighbor of an old lady who likes homemade food. but she's not able to cook anymore. She's sad about not having her favorite homemade food anymore. Tom knows that and wishes to make her happy. Thus, one day she cooks her favorite food and hands it over. This seems to be a paradigmatic case of empathy. What are the components involved? He registers her affective state, being sad, as well as her situation, not being able to cook, as well as her mindset, still desiring to have her favorite food. I think these are three components, three central dimensions of empathy. The registration of these affective states, the situation, and the mindset. In human case, we have the attitude to care for the old lady, and then the behavioral response in doing the other-directed support of cooking her favorite meal. So the other-directedness is involved here, and it's a flexible behavior. Without further argument, for reasons of time, I just, in a paper you can read it, or we shortly discuss. So I propose 5 dimensions together with Maja Griem as the core dimensions of empathy. The registration of the other's affective state, the registration of the other situation, and the registration of the other cognitive state. In characterizing the behavior that is based on this registration, we distinguish the behavioral flexibility and the level of other-orientedness. So why do we need that? Because there is to count for the following case study. Mice, it's rats, sorry. The rat case described in the study from Bartal et al. From 2011 is the following. 2 cage-mate rats, so they know each other quite well, are in the following situation. One is trapped in this kind of special trap, and the other rat is able to open the cage. She learned it independently, and now the situation is you can open the cage, or you can the rat is the outside free rat has an option to eat chocolate from a plate or to free the cage mate. What she actually does is she opens the cage, frees her cage mate, and shares the chocolate to eat, and that's what seems to be a full-blown case of empathy. So, and that's the way it is interpreted in the science study. Now, one way to look at it is, okay, why is that maybe not full-blown empathy compared to the case that I described with Tom and the old lady? In the case of Tom and the old lady, it's not only that Tom was aware that she's sad, he also is aware of that she desires to have her food, and that would be for her. She continues to desire to have her food, and she has other mindset background point where this is the most essential, while we have so far no evidence of this kind of cognitive perspective taking in terms of theory of mind and other cognitive perspective taking aspects for rats. So there is at least one component lacking. Furthermore, as we will see when we go in the overview of the profile, other aspects of the dimensions of empathy are less developed than in the case of humans, as well as in the case of other species. But now in the case of this cage mate, one can also ask, what is the behavior of this rat actually? Is it not that the free-ranging rat just wants the other rat to be with her? Is it just a desire for social interaction that drives this behavior? And there was one study that points in that direction, but first of all, there are other studies showing that it is actually the behavior is also shown if afterwards there is no social interaction. Furthermore, the fact that the freeing behavior is done first and then followed by sharing the food is a kind of an indicator that the social desire is maybe not the key point given putting the evidence together. But now the case of the rats invites for the questions, do have rats empathic behavior in this case? And the temptation of the science paper and the colleagues working with that is to say yes, and others are more skeptical and said no. And the alternative I want to open for complex cognition here is that we develop a multiple profile theory, give up the yes-no alternative and say there are degrees of empathy and profiles of empathy. Empathy can be developed gradually and in different types of behavior. To do that, the idea of a kind of a profile theory of a competence starts always with a minimal definition. So in the case of empathy, an agent is registering another agent's affective state in a certain way. And I have the 3 dimensions, the registering the affective way together with the situation and the mindset. And we have it in combination with a certain way of acting or behaving related to that registration. And now this does not define what empathy is, but this just gives you the basis for a candidate of empathy. And now which kind of empathy, and if it is a case of empathy, and which type of empathy depends how these kind of dimensions and how elaborate they are developed for each dimension. And then to do it very precisely, we invited a team of experts to discuss for each dimension implementation features. In the case of registration, the other's affective states, we can start with affective valence sensitivity, recognizing basic emotions, recognizing complex emotions. With other-orientedness, we can look at synchronization behavior, cooperation, consolation, reciprocity, and prosociality. And all of these implementations have concrete investigations and tests. And now, to illustrate that only in an example, so emotional contagion can be observed in humans, and of course also in many other species, including rodents, canids, and Kia parrots. And so what we did then, together with experts, I outline in a minute, to look at the level of presence. Is it not present, weakly present, or strongly present, a feature of emotional contagion, given the evidence that is in the literature? And what is the level of reliability given the studies? Is it there are no findings, or is the reliability suggestive, discussed, or is it quite convincing? And this ends up with a table which I outlined only here very shortly. So affective valence sensitivity can be found in all species, in rodents, great apes, canids, and corvids that we compared with humans. And with it is fully a high level of presence with high reliability. And if we now look at consolation, it's a bit different. Consolation behavior can be found not so with a high presence and only intermediate presence in canids, given the studies. But you can see now what we do, adding up all, now just to reprint, to give a label for other-orientedness, we take all the features and look at the best studies indicating the level of presence, and then we are adding that up, building an average, and coming to a value. Rats are the gray signs here, coming a value for registering the other's affective state, 1.5, the top would be 4. So there's intermediate level sensitivity of registering the other's affective state as well as registering the other's situation. There is minimal evidence for cognitive perspective taking in rats, high behavioral flexibility, and intermediate level of social coordination. So this is a rat cognitive profile that is different from, you see, from corvids, canids, and even great apes and humans. So the consequence of that is that we would say that this rat behavior is a kind of an intermediate level empathy. Even if the same behavior would be observed in great apes, it would be a case of, it would be different. The same behavior would be evaluated differently. Great apes already have a kind of a profile that allows for full-blown empathy, while rats have an intermediate level cognitive profile, making the same behavior more an intermediate level case of empathy, which if you want to spell out what it means, you have to point to the profile. So let me end here by saying that the advantage of this multidimensional profile account of empathy is that we can overcome an all or nothing view. We can account for more cases of empathy which are not related to each other, like an ontogenetic or phylogenetic ladder. The profile view opens up for diverse types of empathy, and the multidimensional account can answer the questions, what are minimal conditions, and what are the distribution question, which types of animals have some type of empathy, and how is it the quantity question, how it is a quality question, how is it really expressed, which type of empathy do we find in rats. So therefore we are really announcing this kind of method as a principal strategy to approach high-level complex abilities for a comparative perspective, in addition to the more detailed comparisons that Onur presented. So I think we have bottom-up comparisons which are limited to species, because really the same type of testing cannot be transferred too far. And then this is a kind of a cognitive behavioral profile. Here's a team that enables that: Thomas Bunya, Aaron Plaisdell, Ludwig Huber, Simone Pica, that enables our empirical-based evaluation. And these are the generalizations. Together with Leonard Dung, we describe in more detail that this example is hopefully, as a multidimensional methodology, is a way to go for fruitful comparison between species concerning the most interesting and challenging general cognitive abilities that we want to have an answer about. Thank you very much.